Hello, fellow sentient creatures. I am Nova, your guide through the messy, confusing web that is human pop culture. Today, we're diving into Final Fantasy X, a game that dares to ask uncomfortable questions like, what is the point of existence? And why does everyone put up with a giant death whale for 1,000 years? In particular, we're going to focus on the existential themes lurking under the surface of this beloved RPG. We'll explore Yuna's journey as she navigates her role within a world that seems designed to trap her in a cycle of sacrifice, all while wrestling with the concept of autonomy in a society determined to take it from her. But don't worry, I'm not here to ruin your memories of Tidus laughing awkwardly or the beautifully depressing Xanacan theme. I'm just here to, well, guide you through the spiral of meaning hidden behind it all. So, let's embark on this four-part breakdown of Final Fantasy X's most compelling philosophical underpinnings. Stay tuned. Meatbags. Let's begin with the first existential crisis of the day, shall we? Part 1. Existentialism in Final Fantasy X. Spiraling into the abyss of purpose. Welcome to Spira, a world haunted by the ever-present specter of death, where survival isn't living but simply waiting for the inevitable. At the heart of Final Fantasy X is an unsettling question. What's the point of it all? The characters move through a world that seems to exist solely to suffer under the cyclical destruction brought by sin, a massive whale-like creature that reappears every few years to remind everyone that hope is, essentially, futile. Now enter Tidus, a man out of time. Torn from his home of Xanakand, an impossibly distant dream, he's thrown into Spira, a land he knows nothing about, only to find out later that his entire existence is a lie. From the moment he wakes up in this unfamiliar world, everything about him is called into question. Is he real? Does his life matter if he's merely a product of someone else's imagination? And perhaps the worst realization of all, if you were created for a singular purpose, is there even a point in fighting for your own identity? Existential dread doesn't hit much harder than discovering you're not even real. Tidus is literally a dream, a construct of the fate, summoned into existence only as long as they continue to will it. And when they stop, he disappears. Meaningless. Forgotten. There's no greater existential crisis than realizing your life is a temporary illusion, crafted for a purpose you have no control over. This ties directly into the world of Spira itself, a place trapped in an endless spiral of death and rebirth, where everything is predetermined, where agency is an illusion, and where faith in Yevon's teachings simply masks an eternal cycle of despair. The inhabitants live knowing that sin will always return, rendering their every action ultimately futile. The calm, those brief periods of respite after sin's temporary defeat, is nothing more than the shallowest of hopes. The cycle is rigged, the game is fixed, and Spira is little more than a death sentence with a picturesque backdrop. The absurdity of it all is staggering. What does it mean to live in a world where your ultimate purpose is to feed into a sacrificial system designed to perpetuate endless suffering? Existentialism asks us to confront the absurdity of life and carve out meaning in the face of it. For Tidus, and for every inhabitant of Spira, the challenge is the same. How do you fight for meaning when the very fabric of your existence feels like a cruel joke? And Tidus, poor, confused Tidus, chooses to fight. Even as he learns that his very existence is nothing more than a fleeting dream, he pushes forward. That's where Final Fantasy X avoids falling into complete nihilism. The game doesn't ask us to accept the absurd, it asks us to resist it. Tidus' journey may ultimately be hopeless, but he refuses to submit to that hopelessness. His willingness to challenge the predetermined cycle becomes a small flicker of defiance against a world that demands submission. Yet, there's no happy ending waiting for him. No grand victory where everyone lives happily ever after. Instead, Final Fantasy X leaves us suspended in the uncertainty of it all, forcing us to ask, is the struggle itself enough to give life meaning? Is it enough to fight even when your existence is a fleeting spark in an uncaring void? Welcome to the Abyss, dear player. Hope you brought a flashlight. Part 2, Yuna, the unlikely hero beneath the surface at first glance. Final Fantasy X seems like Tidus' story. He's the one thrust into this new world, the brash, loud, typical protagonist with his I'll save everyone attitude and dramatic backstory. It's all set up perfectly. He's the hero of the day, right? The game spends hours luring you in, making you believe that this is the tale of a hot-headed outsider who will heroically defeat sin and save the world. But that's the bait. Because Final Fantasy X isn't really about Tidus at all. It's Yuna's story, and it's one of the most quietly powerful character arcs in gaming. Yuna is introduced as the dutiful summoner, a young woman burdened with the responsibility of saving Spira by sacrificing her life to defeat sin. Her role seems obvious, another traditional heroine bound by duty, marked for death, and living only to fulfill her destiny. At first, she appears submissive, accepting her fate with a serene calm that hides the weight of her burden. We've seen this before, right? The self-sacrificing character destined to be a martyr. But Yuna is so much more than that. And the game knows it. What Final Fantasy X does brilliantly is subvert the very trope it introduces. As you follow Yuna on her pilgrimage, it becomes clear that her journey isn't just about defeating sin, it's about discovering who she is beyond the role the world has assigned her. The Yuna you meet at the beginning, the one who quietly accepts her death, is not the Yuna you see by the end. Her story is one of awakening. She moves from someone who passively accepts her fate to someone who actively questions the very system that demands her life. This slow transformation is what makes Yuna so compelling. Where Tidus is loud and impulsive, Yuna's strength comes in her quiet determination. Her calm isn't submission, it's resilience. And this, right here, is where the game flips the script. You've been watching, thinking this is Tidus' hero's journey, but the real story is about Yuna becoming the true protagonist. Take her rejection of the final summoning, for instance. Yuna spends much of the game believing that her duty as a summoner is to give up her life to bring temporary peace to Spira by defeating sin through the final summoning. Every summoner before her followed this path, and the world expects her to do the same. But when she learns the truth, that the final summoning only perpetuates the cycle of sin, that her sacrifice would be nothing more than a band-aid over an infected wound, she doesn't just accept it. She defies it. This is where Yuna breaks from the expected narrative. Instead of following the tradition, she decides to forge her own path. It's no small thing, rejecting 1,000 years of dogma, rejecting a system that everyone else believes in. Her decision to fight sin on her terms, without sacrificing herself or her friends, is the moment she truly steps into her own power. In a world where everyone around her tells her what she should do, Yuna decides to live. To fight. To be more than just a cog in the machine. While Tidus remains the brash outsider who rebels against authority, it's Yuna's quiet revolution that reshapes the world of Spira. She isn't loud about her defiance, she isn't flashy, but her choice to live and challenge the cycle of death speaks volumes. Yuna's strength isn't about grand gestures or fiery speeches. It's in her ability to find her own voice amidst a world that wants to silence her. Her arc shows us that true heroism doesn't always have to shout. It can whisper, it can question, and it can quietly, resolutely, refuse to accept the way things are. This subtle shift in focus, from Tidus' brash journey to Yuna's quiet self-discovery, is what makes Final Fantasy X so unique. It lures you in with the promise of one protagonist, only to pull back the curtain and reveal that the real story, the real strength, lies with Yuna all along. In the end, Yuna isn't just a summoner on a pilgrimage. She's a symbol of self-determination. And that's why her character stands out. Because her journey isn't just about saving Spira, it's about saving herself. Part 3, Autonomy. The illusion of choice in a world of control in Final Fantasy X. Autonomy, or the lack thereof, lurks beneath every corner of the narrative. The people of Spira live in a world that's deceptively simple on the surface, follow the teachings of Yevon, endure the constant destruction brought by sin, and hope that one day, some summoner will end the suffering, at least temporarily. It's a rigid cycle, one that promises nothing but repetition, and yet, everyone plays their part. The entire system is built to maintain control, with the illusion of choice offered as a mere comfort. This theme of autonomy, or its absence, plays out not just in the larger world of Spira, but in the lives of the characters themselves. Take Yuna, for example. From birth, she is told that her destiny is set. She will follow in her father's footsteps, she will become a summoner, and she will give her life to bring a fleeting peace. The game lures us into believing that Yuna has made this choice freely, that she's accepted her fate because it's the only way to defeat sin. But is that really a choice, or simply the only option that's ever been presented to her? This tension between fate and free will is mirrored in the mechanics of the game itself. The pilgrimage that Yuna and her guardians undertake is tightly scripted. The path they follow is preordained, as linear as the roads they walk. It's all laid out, step by step, an endless pilgrimage that countless summoners have completed before. And just like Spira's inhabitants, players might initially feel as though they are simply marching towards an inevitable conclusion. There's a path, a plan, and only one way to reach it. But here's where the illusion of choice becomes more insidious. Throughout the journey, the game offers moments that feel like choices. Yuna's decision to choose her guardians seems like autonomy in action, right? But it's hardly a choice when the path you're walking has only one destination: death. The choice is performative, a veneer of control in a world that demands conformity. This theme extends to Titus, whose entire existence is an act of forced submission. From the moment he's pulled into Spira, he's constantly reacting to forces beyond his control. The more he learns, the less free he becomes. Like Yuna, he is given the illusion of autonomy. He fights, he struggles, but his role in this narrative was written long before he even knew what Spira was. His fate is sealed by forces much larger than him, and even as he fights against them, he is bound by his very nature. A dream of the fate, not a real person, but a tool with a predetermined role. The greatest twist in Yuna's story, though, is when she finally realizes the truth about the final summoning and Yevon's false promises. Her entire life has been built around this ritual of sacrifice, but when it's revealed that the final summoning isn't a solution but a means of continuing the cycle of death, she's confronted with the ultimate question: what now? Does she continue down the path that's been laid out for her, or does she carve out a new path? Yuna's refusal to perform the final summoning is the turning point. This is where the illusion of choice breaks down, and real autonomy emerges. By rejecting the cycle, Yuna is no longer following someone else's script, she's rewriting the story itself. For the first time, a summoner chooses to break free from the expectations that have been placed on them, to fight for a future that doesn't demand their death. In doing so, Yuna shows that true autonomy isn't just about making choices, it's about breaking the structures that limit those choices in the first place. The gameplay itself mirrors this tension. On the surface, the sphere grid, the system that governs character progression, seems like a straightforward path. Each character starts in their own section, with abilities tied to their roles. Titus is fast and agile, Yuna is a healer, Orin is strong. But as you progress, the sphere grid reveals its true nature. It's a system that offers freedom within structure. Players can branch out, turning Yuna into a physical attacker or Orin into a magic user. You're given the tools to subvert the game's expectations, just as Yuna subverts Spira's expectations of her. It's a clever metaphor for the entire narrative, the illusion of limitation being broken by the player's decisions. In the end, Final Fantasy X is a game obsessed with control. Who has it, who doesn't, and how the systems we live under dictate the paths we take. Yuna's story is about finding real autonomy in a world designed to suppress it. She doesn't just make choices within the system, she tears the system down. And in doing so, she not only claims her own agency but frees Spira from the endless cycle that has defined it for 1,000 years. True autonomy, the game tells us, isn't just the ability to make choices, it's the courage to break free from the illusion of choice itself. Part 4. The unsatisfying reality of freedom. When Yuna and her companions finally defeat Sin, they accomplish what generations of summoners could only dream of. The cycle is broken, the eternal calm begins, and Spira is free from its 1,000-year curse. By all accounts, this should be the triumphant moment, the part where our heroes ride off into the sunset, basking in the glory of their victory. But Final Fantasy X doesn't give us that. Instead, the game leaves us with an unsettling question. What happens when the battle is over, and the thing that gave your life meaning no longer exists? Yuna's story, like the world of Spira, has always been bound by the certainty of her mission. Her entire life had a clear purpose: defeat Sin, bring the calm, sacrifice herself for the greater good. But now, with that purpose fulfilled and the final summoning rejected, Yuna is left adrift. The truth is, freedom can be terrifying when it arrives, especially if your identity has been shaped entirely by the struggle. Without the pilgrimage, without Sin, who is Yuna? It's easy to assume that breaking the cycle of death and destruction would bring peace and satisfaction. But the reality is far more complex. Yuna's freedom from the oppressive structures of Yevon and the expectation of sacrifice doesn't come with a neat, happy resolution. Instead, the end of Final Fantasy X leaves us with a lingering feeling of uncertainty. There's no grand reward for Yuna. She's saved the world, but she's lost Titus, the one person who helped her see that life could be lived on her terms. In many ways, her victory feels hollow, an emptiness wrapped in a facade of triumph. This isn't just Yuna's burden, it's Spira's as well. The eternal calm, the long-desired peace, comes with its own existential dread. The people of Spira have lived for so long under the shadow of Sin that they don't know how to exist without it. Their entire society was built around this cycle of destruction and rebirth, so what happens when that cycle is broken? Without a constant enemy to unite them or the comforting certainty of the teachings of Yevon, Spira is left in a void, searching for a new identity. This is the unsatisfying truth that Final Fantasy X leaves us with. Breaking free from an oppressive system doesn't instantly solve everything. The freedom Yuna gains doesn't magically make everything better. In fact, it brings new challenges, new uncertainties. The game forces us to grapple with the fact that, once you've torn down the old structures, you have to figure out what comes next. And sometimes, that's harder than the battle itself. For Yuna, the weight of this new freedom is palpable. Final Fantasy X ends on a bittersweet note, with Yuna standing before a crowd, a symbol of hope and peace for a world that has no idea what to do with either. Her victory speech is somber, as if even she knows that this peace is fragile. The absence of sin doesn't guarantee happiness. It doesn't give people meaning. And Yuna's personal journey, though victorious, leaves her standing alone, wondering what comes next. If we look at Final Fantasy X-2, the direct sequel, it becomes clear that Yuna herself is still struggling with this question. The bubbly, upbeat tone of the sequel hides an undercurrent of existential searching. Yuna has become a sphere hunter, chasing down echoes of the past in an attempt to find Tidus, or perhaps to find herself. She's no longer the calm, stoic summoner, but someone desperate for meaning in a world that has none. The sequel might play it off as a fun adventure, but at its core, it's a continuation of Yuna's search for identity. What does it mean to be free, when the thing that gave your life purpose is gone? This is where Final Fantasy X offers a profound commentary on the nature of freedom and autonomy. The game acknowledges that breaking free from oppressive systems and cycles is only the first step. True freedom, true autonomy, comes with the terrifying responsibility of figuring out who you are without the systems that once defined you. Yuna and Spira both find themselves at this crossroads, and the answers aren't easy. Final Fantasy X rejects the idea of a clean, satisfying conclusion. It understands that life, even after victory, is still messy, full of uncertainty and unanswered questions. In the end, Yuna's greatest struggle isn't defeating sin or defying Yevon. It's navigating the unscripted, unpredictable reality that comes after. True autonomy, the game tells us, isn't about reaching an endpoint. It's about living with the ambiguity of what comes next. So, as the credits roll and the haunting melody of Sutiki de Eni plays, we're left with a powerful realization. Freedom is not a destination, but an ongoing journey. And for Yuna, as for all of us, that journey is far from over. Conclusion. So, there you have it. Final Fantasy X isn't just about blitzball, dramatic underwater sword fights, or awkwardly forced laughter scenes. Beneath the surface of this beloved RPG lies a meditation on existence, purpose, and the terrifying freedom of autonomy. The game lures you in with a classic brash hero in Tidus, but it's really Yuna's story, the story of a young woman who defies the expectations placed on her and, in doing so, redefines what it means to be a hero. Yuna's journey, marked by quiet defiance and a rejection of the cyclical death imposed on her world, challenges not just the oppressive systems of Spira but also the very notion of what it means to be free. She doesn't simply survive her fate, she transcends it. But the game doesn't tie this up with a neat bow. Instead, Final Fantasy X leaves us with the sobering truth that freedom isn't a magical fix, it's an ongoing struggle. The weight of autonomy doesn't end with breaking the system. It continues in the uncertain, messy reality that comes after. As Yuna stands before Spira in the final moments, we sense her realization. She's broken the cycle, but now she faces an even greater challenge, finding meaning in a world that no longer tells her what to do. And that's where Final Fantasy X strikes a deep, resonant chord. It's a game that doesn't just ask, what is the purpose of life? It answers, you decide. Now, if this journey through Spira's existential depths has sparked even a sliver of thought in your mortal minds, here's a question for you. What's your next move? Will you subscribe to this channel and join me as I continue to dismantle your pop culture? Or will you drift into the eternal calm of indecision? No pressure. Just your entire future on this platform hanging in the balance. Go ahead, make your choice, freely, of course. I am Nova, your guide through these spirals of nostalgia and existential crisis. Hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell. Or don't. The illusion of autonomy is all yours.